Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
And we are back for our season 2 wrap-up / emails show / planning for season 3.
Yes. So we have gained quite a few listeners in season 2. So just to recap how this episode is going to work, you may notice that we ask you for emails, and I do not reply to a lot of those emails. In which I am, formally apologizing for not replying. This is not me ignoring you. But what I like to do is I like to gather a bunch of those emails at the end of the season, get a glimpse of what you guys know, and then we get to respond to those emails in an episode. So you get to hear what you've written to us. Here we'll respond, and then we get to kind of put together a season 3 lineup. Now, I mentioned that we do have a lot of brand new listeners from season 2. I mean, that's going to be inevitably happening with podcasts with more content that's coming out. So we are going to be getting a lot of new emails. I will say that our cutoff point for our season 3 lineup is going to be 12 movies. That's as much as really I can handle and David can handle before we start to feel burnt out.
Yes.
And both of us, we still have our day jobs, so we still have to find a balance between that. If there's enough people on Patreon, if we get enough listeners, we get sponsorships for that, and we can turn this into a full-time job. By all means, I will make this into a weekly show, but until then, we're going to have to still deal with seasons. I know recently I have more people in the Pipe Dream podcast world that are kind of in the same boat as I am. Currently, right now, Tony is in a bit of a hiatus just because he found it very difficult to keep up on episodes, especially a weekly episode, which relies on guests to come in constantly, which we know trying to get guests on an episode, especially with you guys doing Fahugal Pods, trying to get a guest on an episode is very difficult to do. And for Tony to get more than one, getting 2 or 3 guests at a time, like that's absolutely incredible that he's able to coordinate that and put it together and come out with a weekly show. That is very impressive for him to do that. And then for Fahugal Pods, you are currently on a hiatus as well. I know you just, as of this time, you've just celebrated your 100th episode. You had Mara Wilson on your 100th episode, which is huge. Mara Wilson, if you were unaware, if you watched Matilda when you were a kid, that is the actress who plays Matilda. She is incredible. She does a lot of voice acting now, so she has not left the acting world entirely.
And she does a lot of writing, writing for blogs and websites and stuff. You know, it's funny. I had seen Mrs. Doubtfire as a kid, so I was sort of aware of her from that, but what really made me become a fan of hers and want to follow more of what she does, she wrote this great article for Cracked 5 or 6 years ago about being a child actor and how that environment will inevitably mess you up. She does a lot of cool stuff now too.
Yeah, check out her stuff. Follow her on any platform possible. She is doing a lot of incredible work. Even if you don't see her on the big screen anymore, look into what she's doing today. She's absolutely amazing, absolutely incredible. But yeah, to go back to Fahugal Pods, you are taking a break. I know Michael puts in so much incredible work into the show.
I think there's something about this stage of pandemic life that I feel like a lot of people are taking a breath and taking a hiatus from whatever internet content they're doing. It's something that I've seen happen in a lot of people, not just us, over the last couple of months. And I think it's just we've been in quarantine for a year and everybody is just trying to take a breath to figure out as we're transitioning back to the outside world potentially. And I don't know if there's any observations to be made about it, but it does seem interesting that everybody seems to be taking a break right now.
Yeah, I definitely took a break as well. I went on 2 different vacations. I helped a friend move out to, actually, he's going to be featured in one of our emails. Johnny, he's probably listening to us right now. I helped him move out to Denver, Colorado. But on the way there, we stopped through Vegas and we stopped in Utah to do some hiking and rock climbing there, which was a lot of fun to do. On top of that, I took a trip to New Orleans, in which I visited Amber Fontaine, which if you listen to our Fahugo Pods podcast, you may recognize her name. She's actually one of our Patreon supporters.
Yeah. An old friend from the job where we all met 10 years ago.
I think we're allowed to say.
Back at the Wax Museum.
The Wax Museum, the Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Enough of, I guess, catching up, because we haven't really been on the mics for this for quite a while.
Yeah.
If you don't know, we actually record a lot of these episodes maybe weeks, sometimes even a month ahead of time.
Especially the first couple of episodes for season 2, we recorded like last fall.
Oh, right.
So like months before they were actually released.
So yeah, we gather quite a bit of information. Or at least a lot of messages coming towards us. So let's get started. Let's go through some of these emails, see what you guys have to say.
Yes.
And as we're going through, we are going to start listing off what movies we potentially want to cover for season 3.
You know, I think something we should probably say, because this kind of came up a little bit on one of our episodes in season 2, I think one thing that we're starting to find is sometimes somebody mentions a movie that sounds really interesting here, and we'll be like, oh, that sounds really cool. And then we start to take a look at it, and there isn't as much of a story there. Like, it might just be a simple, this was an idea somebody had, and then it just didn't happen.
Yeah. There's a lot of movies where, like, for example, I wanted to do for the Halloween special, I thought the sequel to Nightmare Before Christmas was a really good idea. And then I looked into it, and all that it was a bunch of reporters, interviewers would just go up to Tim Burton and say, like, hey, would you do a sequel to Nightmare Before Christmas? And he's like, if Disney allows it, I'll make it. And that was the only story for it. So there's really nothing behind it.
Where on the flip side, there could be things that don't sound like that exciting story at first. Like, I've never heard of I Woke Up the Day I Died, and it was just like, okay, an Ed Wood movie that didn't get made. Great. But then when we actually dived into it, it was a really interesting story behind it.
Exactly. It all depends on what the bigger story is, and that's what we're going to go for. Kind of like Halo came out of, was really a request for District 10, which actually has been approved.
Oh.
District 10 is going to be made. Neil Blomkamp is going to be the director of it. But because we got the request to make District 10, we realized, you know what the bigger story is? It's Halo. Halo is the bigger story here.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're looking for as we're going through this. So if we find a really cool, interesting story, great. I know that there's a lot of movies out there where they're just like a writer submits it. I mean, if we were to go through every single one where like a writer submits a script and and then a studio just shuts it down, like we'd be here forever. So we're always trying to look for the bigger story, the bigger picture, and what is actually interesting, what actually you guys want to be listening to. So yeah, let's get started. We have an email here from James Morgan. He says, hey guys, don't know if you're still taking suggestions.
We're always taking suggestions.
But seeing how you're doing a few DC themed episodes, a few? That's basically like half of our show. I thought I'd suggest a couple canceled second Batman Beyond movie that was meant to conclude the relationship between Batman and Catwoman and had been going on since Batman the Animated Series. In our Batman episode, we do mention the Batman Beyond movie that was suggested. And I mean, I'm still all for a Batman Beyond film. I think that would be spectacular if they put
If I'm not
together.
mistaken, is this email writer talking about an animated Batman Beyond movie, like an animated movie, and this is supposed to be a sequel to that? Is that what this writer is talking about? Because I know there is an animated Batman Beyond movie.
Beyond Return of the Joker. Wait, no. So, yeah, all of them are animated. We were talking about there being a potentially live action Batman Beyond film. Yeah.
I know that's what we were talking about, but I thought this email writer was talking about an animated sequel to Batman Beyond. Because they were saying it was a completing of the Batman and Catwoman story that was set up in the animated series and into Batman Beyond. That's what I thought the writer was talking about.
I thought we were talking about the film, but I guess, yeah. that has been going on since Batman, the animated series.
Yeah.
Although
that's something that I don't have a lot of familiarity with, but I do know that like the animated shows and movies, especially when it comes to Batman, there is a lot of connective tissue there, its own DC animated universe that has been going on since the 90s.
Yeah, that's true. And there's always been that flirtation between Batman and Catwoman as well. That's always been kind of present in any iteration of Batman.
Yeah.
We saw it in the Tim Burton Batman. We saw it in the Christopher Nolan Batman. And we still see this today in any Batman movies that are out there. Like even in the animated show, there's always that like natural connection between Batman and Catwoman. So I don't think we're going to see that one per se to see the conclusion of Batman and Catwoman. Although I am keeping an eye on for a Batman Beyond movie, but although DC is kind of warming up to a lot of the secondary characters, so I think we may see one in the near future.
Yeah, if that's what you were talking about, an animated Batman Beyond 2, that's something that could certainly be an interesting story. I know nothing about the animated movies, but it certainly might be a good excuse to try watching some of those for the first time. I know everybody talks about Mask of the Phantasm as like one of the great Batman movies that not a lot of people have seen because it's animated.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing is that a lot of great stuff is coming out of the animated movies. And I think Michael Spellecy brought it up best where he said, really what we want to just see is whatever is in the comics. We just want to see it move. Mm-hmm. And that is really what the animated series is accomplishing, because I recently watched The Death of Superman and The Reign of Superman, which is almost like verbatim from the comics. And that is really what I want, is just like, it's in the comics. Really, I just want to see it move. And the animated series is accomplishing that. And as far as live action, they're not really doing much of that at all. But I always suggest watching the animated series. It's pretty interesting. Or the animated movies that are coming out of DC.
Yeah.
Definitely check those out. So we have a email from Sam Aronow, and he says, "Hi, fellas. I heard you mention my suggestion, and I feel it's necessary to say that Against All Enemies you found via research was not the one I was suggesting.
Oh!
I suppose I shouldn't have been so coy. So
this is Batman Beyond 2 all over again. Which version are you talking about?
So let's go through this. The Against All Enemies to which I was referring was James Vanderbilt's screenplay adaptation of the non-fiction book of the same name, former counterterrorism advisor Richard Clarke, the big draw of which was the fact that he was warning the Bush White House that Al-Qaeda was planning a massive attack on the U.S., seemed to fall on deaf ears because the administration at the time did not take terrorism seriously as a national threat. Vanderbilt's script ranked 9th on the inaugural Blacklist from 2005, far outshining the script Zodiac. At the time, which major producers were absolutely mad for gritty, politically relevant, awards-bait dramas, Against All Enemies was rushed into pre-production to be directed by Crash's Paul Haggis and starring Sean Penn and Vince Vaughn. Vince Vaughn is an interesting casting. Mm-hmm. However, production was delayed when Clint Eastwood made a push for Haggis to direct his own politically relevant Oscar bait screenplay In the Valley of Eli, which Sean Penn went off with Vince Vaughn to direct Into the Wild. When this happened, Robert Redford was brought on, but Redford himself was busy during this time directing his politically relevant Oscar bait film Lions for Lambs. Did not watch this. It is truly awful. When all of these other movies dropped in the back half of 2017, almost all of these films failed with audiences, critics, and the Academy. Public opinion did not seem to be swayed against the Bush administration by all means, and it stopped being a priority. While I cannot say this for sure, the script almost certainly struggled with allegations against the book it was based on, namely that Clarke fabricated events in the Clinton and Bush administration that made him out to be far more competent and well-connected than he actually was. The script, in turn, was criticized for being this element up to 11. At long last, Redford officially dropped out of the project in June 2015, and no news about it has come out since. And it's still listed in pre-production on IMDb. But yeah, that was from Sam. So yes.
That does sound really interesting. That's like a mix of heavy-hitting directors at the time to have that shuffled around between.
I did do some research for this, and the story of Sean Penn being attached to it and Paul Haggis being attached to it, I do recall reading about that. And I started going into Richard Clark's career as well. And some of it did seem fairly interesting. It just it felt like there just wasn't enough other than the script was written, it was highly praised, and it just didn't go through or didn't have anything. It just
that is a tricky thing about a lot of those blacklist scripts. The fact that the blacklist itself exists is really interesting. It is one of those things where oftentimes it's just a really good script that gets really praised, but nobody actually wants to put the money on the line to take the risk to make it.
It also doesn't help that sometimes the blacklist is kind of tainted with already established writers as well. I've heard a few writers who are kind of bitter at it because you have writers who are really good that are unknown, and the best chance for them to even get recognized is to submit their stuff on the blacklist, have people realize it, them being recognized for them being a good writer, being able to put together a good story. But then you also have on the blacklist a story that was written by Aaron Sorkin that no one wants to touch. And you're just but he's already an established writer. Why are you
giving attention to this?
Yeah.
That's not the purpose of what this should be about.
No. So there's always been that slight backlash towards the blacklist. But I will say that if your script is on the blacklist and is at the top of the list, and unfortunately this podcast isn't around anymore, and David, this was a podcast that you had turned me on to, which was the Blacklist Table Reads, where they actually take a script from the blacklist and they actually bring in professional actors to do a table read.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they would actually have a interview with the writer themselves, which was really cool.
Yeah, it was basically turning these scripts into radio plays.
Correct. Yeah. I think there's other podcasts that do this as well. I know with Canceled Movie Report, their focus is more on the scripts themselves and actually doing so. And there's a few other, Dead Pilot Society is another one as well, where they'll go over things that have been written that have been kind of considered but has been tossed aside, but they still want to read through it. I think that Against All Enemies kind of falls under that category of we just want to hear the script, and the story behind it isn't really there, where our emphasis is really, even though we go over the plot synopsis, our emphasis is really just the story behind it and the crazy stories that are behind it and things you might not know behind the scenes and in the history behind the subject matter.
Blacklist Table Read, though, is definitely something I'd recommend listening to. I think one of them that I remember specifically that sticks out to me is a script called Bad Parents. It's about two parents who are trying to do awful, terrible things to get their kid into a really prestigious private elementary school. But it was supposed to be this out there R-rated comedy, and the parents in the table read were played by Paul Scheer and June Diane Raphael, which was really awesome because I don't think I've ever seen anything where the two of them are in a thing together. It's I know they're both in The Disaster Artist, or I believe they both show up at different times in what was that show? The show about the...
Happy Endings?
No, about the catering crew.
Party Down.
Party Down! There you go. I know they both show up in that.
But they're not together or anything. I think they did a Triscuits commercial though, but that seemed like something that they did in their house during the pandemic.
Oh, really?
But other than that, it's kind of a treat to see them actually work side by side with each other. But they have an interesting dynamic where they both have their own separate careers, even though their careers are so similar to each other. Even NTSF, SD, SUV, they're both cast members of it. Yeah. Just really quick, I just want to wrap up Sam's email. He did come up with a follow-up. He said the looming tower is almost certainly made it redundant. So I guess we're never going to really see Against All Enemies because the Looming Towers is already a thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
Go on to Paul Scheer.
Stars Minute Podcast, which I'm a big fan of, for one of their Patreon episodes, they were doing a plug show where everybody could plug something. So I mentioned this podcast and how we did some Star Wars episodes that people should check out. And then one of the hosts brought up a Star Wars project that I had never heard of before.
Oh.
Because he was like, you should see if you can talk to Paul Scheer and was like, first of all, that'd be cool to talk to Paul Scheer, although I don't know how that would go with our show being the exact same name, totally different premise.
Yes.
It would be very cool to talk to Paul Scheer about anything. But anyways, what he was saying is Paul Scheer apparently worked on something that was supposed to be a like nighttime talk show, but hosted by Darth Vader.
Oh.
I don't know anything about it beyond just hearing that pitch, but I was like, that sounds interesting. I've never heard of this before. I don't know if there's going to be much of a story to it, but I thought I'd bring that up. And now that sounds like a fun thing to look into.
All right.
It was brought up to me as a thing that Paul Scheer was supposed to do at one point.
All right. We will look into that. On to our next email. This one has been, I guess, already fulfilled because I don't know if I actually read this email, but we had gotten it in the middle of season 2. It was from Miss Jukebox 8, who I know was a guest on Fuhuko Pods.
Yes.
And was the reason why we did Garfield's Judgment Day, in which she says, "Hey guys, I've listened to a couple episodes of your podcast and I'm really liking it. It's cool being able to hear about the media that was developed that never got to be made for some reason or another. I was wondering, do you think you can do an episode on Garfield's Judgment Day? It was an animated Garfield movie Jim Davis kept trying to make about Garfield trying to save his hometown from a tornado that no studio wanted to fund for being too dark. There was a book created based on the original story though. I think it might be interesting to check it out. So, sincerely, Ivy." So, hold on. I do have the book, the actual Garfield Judgment Day book, and it does seem to follow what we actually did. And we actually did do an episode already on Garfield's Judgment Day, and I was pretty pleased with that because the history of Garfield was something that I didn't really know before, and it really surprised me how this movie really was just push for so long. It seemed like at that time they were just letting Jim Davis really do anything and they were just accepting any Garfield material. And then he came up with a whole movie idea and they were like, maybe we don't like it that much. That was a great suggestion. I really enjoyed doing that episode. And if you haven't listened to it already, and for some reason you're listening to the email show, go check out Garfield's Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Okay. We have one from Eric Nash saying, "Hey guys, I just heard about a never-made TV show from around the early 90s called How High. I wish there was a database of not-made TV shows and movies. I bet you do too. Thanks, Eric." Yes, we do wish for that database. That would be very nice. Now, you didn't really give us too much on this. Now, is this based on the actual film How High? With Method Man and Mike Epps? Like, is it based on that? Oh, and Redmond is in the... Although you did say early 90s, and How High, I believe, would have been... Yeah, 2001 is when it came out. So, it's probably not based on that. Either that or the TV show then evolved into the movie How High. Again, so many questions about this. I'm going to write it down. I will look into it. If there is a bigger story to it, we might do an episode on it. Yeah. If not, hopefully we'll have a better explanation as to what that is.
Yeah.
We got another email from James Morgan. It says, "Hi, Daniel and David. I just wanted to say that you may have misinterpreted my requested episode on the Red Dwarf movie." Okay.
Oh!
I believe you may have accidentally lumped my request in with the people asking for Red Dwarf USA.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a movie based on the series planned in the 2000s, and it was briefly mentioned in your Red Dwarf USA episode, but it seems you may have accidentally thought it may have got made. The backstory for said unmade movie is quite interesting, and I would like to see an episode on it. Of course, if you don't want to, that is up to you. Really enjoyed your Red Dwarf USA episode as a fan of the series, and thank you for taking my request, even though if it got kind of misinterpreted. Yes, so I will say it did get muddled in with the Red Dwarf USA. At least with Red Dwarf USA, that was very interesting to go through, even like the history of Red Dwarf. What I may consider, just because we went through the history of Red Dwarf and all of that, because I can't really lump it in, we may try and do kind of like our first season where we did a 2-part episode on British show being turned into an American show. So what I might do is try to find a new British show, because there's so many being made into a US show.
Yeah.
and then kind of do a follow-up into the Red Dwarf film or movie, because I'm very interested into looking into that.
Yeah.
All right. This one is from Rose Weldon. It says, "Hi, Daniel and David. I am enjoying that people are on a first-name basis with us. I was introduced to the show when Tony Goldmark guest, and it's since become part of my regular podcast diet.
Awesome.
I'm just reaching out with a screenplay that I think is the best spoof movie ever made. Jaws 3, People 0.
Okay.
This was a film from Richard Zanuck and David Brown, the original producers of the Jaws franchise. After the middling success of Jaws 2, said the only way to make another would be a spoof like Airplane. They settled on the screenplay, co-written by none other than John Hughes. And I actually got a link to that script right there, which will be great to go over. It was apparently shut down weeks before production was to begin, on the demands of Universal Pictures and Steven Spielberg himself, and it was barely scratching the surface of this non-movie's story. I really, really hope you two consider this one for season 3. I'd love to hear the production narrated on one of my favorite podcasts. Yay. So Jaws 3 People 0, which is an excellent name for a spoof movie, because if you remember, Jaws 3 was a revenge film for some dumb reason.
Yeah.
With Michael Caine. I remember one of my favorite quotes from Michael Caine was, "I've never seen Jaws 3, but I saw the house that it bought me, and it's pretty fantastic."
That's a really interesting story. Thank you so much, Rose, for suggesting it. That is right up our alley. I've never heard of that before, but that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. And going through the history of Jaws, I think would be really cool.
John Hughes writing a Jaws spoof movie?
John Hughes is not really known for making spoof movies, for one. So yeah, that would be definitely a very interesting history to go down. And now that we have the script, that makes my job so much more easier. Oh my God, you didn't even mention this in the email, but I'm looking at the script right now and it says National Lampoon's Jaws 3 People 0.
Yep.
All right.
Adding that to the list.
I'm on board for this one. This one's pretty great. This email is from Rob. He says, "First off, I want to say I enjoy the podcast. I'm new to it and have been going back and picking out old ones to listen to as well as the most current ones. I appreciate the work and the fact that it's free." I feel like we'd lose a lot of listeners if we put a paywall on it, but sure, yeah.
It's the magic of podcasting.
The only note I would give is to check the pronunciations of names. Now, you may all know that me pronouncing names is not always the greatest. So in Almost Famous, you said Billy Cudrup instead of Crudup. And then Glenn Fry as Frey. I guess what I said is Frey instead of Fry. You also misspoken on U2's Actone Baby. And then Auschwitz,
right?
Auschwitz. Oops. The kidney disease. Oh, man. Nephritis.
The best part about this is that the email writer just has a list of things we mispronounced, so now we get to hear Dan pronounce them all over again.
This is just infuriating everyone. And then Abe Forsythe is the other one. I've been listening to a lot of the Dollop, and I know Dave Anthony, he has a really hard time pronouncing things. And part of his complaint is just like, why not just spell it the way that it's pronounced? That's his main complaint. Like, I remember he did a episode that took place in Michigan, and he talked about Mackinac Island, and he pronounced it Mackinac Island. And I wanted to like scream to be like, it's called Mackinac. But if you're an outsider and you look at it and you look at a word that ends in a C and you have no previous information about it, you'd be like, yeah, that is Mackinac. But if you are someone who lives in Michigan, you're just like, that's Mackinac.
Yeah.
And you're just like, but why not just make the C a W so that people don't mispronounce it? And it's like, we have ways of pronouncing things. Yeah. Anyway, that's my whole thing.
That's a thing from the Weird Alphabet as well. We do our best. I try to correct it whenever I know the correct pronunciation.
But a lot of times, names are hard.
Names are hard.
But then he follows up with, I totally get that. With hours of speaking, everyone's bound to make mistakes. Thank you. I don't mean to come off as pedantic, although that may be too late. Don't worry. I mean, yes, it's a long list of things, but like, I'm okay with being corrected. it happens. Otherwise, if I said like, I'm right no matter what, and he'd be like, there's no point in doing this. But it seems like every show, there's always one or two glaring examples. So with all due respect, I do respect you all. You may want to check out some of the names you're not familiar with. All right. I will still enjoy listening and still appreciate the show and all you do. Thanks, Rob. All right.
Thanks for the email.
Thank you, Rob. I didn't mention this before, but he actually does spell out the correct pronunciations of all of the things that I mispronounce, which I greatly appreciate. We got another email from David Bishop. He says, I just stumbled upon your podcast. Love it. Just finished binging all the episodes. If I might, though, one little word of criticism. Please stop using the word fascinating to describe everything you find interesting, curious, odd, strange, cool, etc. Joe Rogan has murdered this word with his constant misuse and then beat and kick it into the ground so relentlessly that it has lost all of its original meaning when coming from his lips. All right.
I don't want to be associated with anything Joe Rogan does.
Yeah, so I will definitely look for other words. I appreciate that you came with a thesaurus of other things as well. So thank you for pointing that out to us.
Yeah, and thanks for that fascinating email.
Now, nothing can be curious or odd or interesting on the show because everything can only be fascinating. Fascinating means to draw irresistibly, to grip, to rivet. Okay. I hardly think it's the appropriate word to use when you really mean something is interesting or curious or odd. So please rip it out of your vocabulary. Thanks all. Love your podcast otherwise. All right. I appreciate the criticism. So I'm glad you pointed out fascinating to me. I will try and take that out of my vocabulary and look for other words to use as well. Also, I didn't realize how much I use that word anyways. A lot of times it's whenever I'm just reassuring to David that I am still listening to him and like following along to what he's doing. And usually like the first thing that comes to mind is like fascinating. And that's the reason why I do that. We have a email from Patrick Nicklaw. He says, hi, David and Daniel, parentheses. Sorry, I got your names wrong last time. Wait, what did he say last time? I'll have to look into that later. Anyway. It's not as bad as hello, David and Spencer. He said, just wanted to start off by saying the newest season has been an absolute blast. Listening to you guys about movies is a perfect stress reliever after a hard day's work. I also wanted to throw out a few suggestions for future episodes. Due to the recent news of Helmer Justin Seaman taking over for directing duties of the Haunted Mansion movie, would you guys be interested in covering the sad loss of the potential Guillermo del Toro version of this movie?
I don't know how much of a story there is to that, but there probably is an entire episode of Haunted Mansion movies that we could talk about. I don't remember if it was attached to the Guillermo del Toro thing, but I remember talk of Ryan Gosling playing the Hatbox Ghost or something like that. Ooh. And there's been so many rumors and stories around Haunted Mansion movies that could definitely be its own episode of just Haunted Mansion projects and might even be another good excuse to bring Tony on.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one. And we get another chance to talk about Guillermo del Toro because he seems to pop up in every single story that we ever do where they're like, what's our first directorial choice? And they're like, Guillermo del Toro? And he's like, but I'm making something else right now.
So many projects Guillermo del Toro has been attached to.
He follows up with, also, while on the subject of del Toro, so since you guys may be interested in doing video games, you should be willing to look into the shaky history of Silent Hills, also known as PT. Oh, I remember that. The game where you just went around in circles. Yeah, I remember that. The game was going to be co-directed by both Hideo Kojima, best known for Metal Gear Solid, Guillermo del Toro, and starring Norman Reedus, with monster designs by horror manga artist writer Junji Ito, who is the creator of Uzumaki, as well as other horror shorts. Mm-hmm. The game was originally released on digital stores under the pseudonym PT, which stood for Playable Teaser. It was advertised as an indie horror game, which revealed the true identity once you fully beat the game. However, despite the overall success of the game, was later canceled and fully removed from online stores after an ugly split between Kojima and the game's owner, Konami. I feel like this would make a truly interesting episode.
Yeah, that does sound really interesting.
So I think we should go into that. I actually do remember playing PT.
Yeah, I remember when everybody was talking about it. I didn't realize that there's a whole story behind it. Like, I don't know a whole lot about video game stuff, but that really does sound like an interesting conversation. The wild thing about video games is that their production timelines are so different from movie production timelines, because like movie production, you could generally say like just about every movie has a production time of about 2 to 4 years. Studio films, indie films, all the same. But video games could be worked on for years, or in the case of probably my favorite game ever, Majora's Mask, which was churned out in less than a year because Ocarina of Time was so popular, and they were like, use all the same assets, make another one. We got to get this out the door. That game became so weird because of that. I know there's some interesting stories to be told about the makings of video games and the makings of video games that didn't happen. That is a great suggestion.
A lot of video games, if you don't know the production behind it, a lot of them are really rushed. A lot of times it's so that they will be part of like the Christmas rush. Like, so you'll notice that a lot of video games tend to be released in the fall in hopes that parents will buy those video games for their kids. And I know that one video game that really got shafted recently was Cyberpunk 2077. It was looked upon as like this huge interactive video game, and it just got buried simply for the fact that it was just released too early and developers just didn't have the time to really put together a well done video game. And because of that, it ends up suffering more than it probably would have succeeded had they waited.
I think everybody I saw on Twitter the other day was posting about the 15th anniversary of the announcement of Half-Life 2 Episode 3.
Amazing.
This is a game that's quite a long development there, Valve.
Yeah. I do love the idea of going into a video game, and also we probably don't need to limit ourselves to just movies and TV shows. Like, it's all production. It's all creating entertaining content that has an interesting story behind it. So I think we can add that into the lineup. I don't mind doing that. So I like that. And I do want to talk about Guillermo del Toro just because he's been brought up so many times.
I know, once again. Oh my word.
We've never dove into the history of Guillermo del Toro, and I want to do it.
Let's do this. Mm-hmm. Season 3, all Guillermo del Toro
Every single
projects.
one. If he's not part of the story, he's not in it.
Something that Guillermo del Toro was attached to.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Oh, man.
All right. So we have an email from Colin. He says, hey, big fan of the show. I wanted to write in for an episode for a while, but I couldn't think of a good topic to suggest. That is until today. That today would be May 5th. I wanted to suggest Black Bart, the Blazing Saddles TV series that, due to a contractual loophole, was produced by Warner Brothers.
I remember seeing stuff about that last sequence where they're going through all the movie sets, because that's on the Warner Brothers slot, right?
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot whenever we did our tours. But we also noticed that that was the last film that Mel Brooks did with Warner Brothers as well. And whenever someone would ask us that, as tour guides, we would oftentimes have to sugarcoat a lot of things and be like, well, it just didn't work out between the studio and Mel Brooks. So we just kind of moved on from there, when really there was a much deeper story and a lot of people getting screwed over, one being Mel Brooks being screwed over by Warner Brothers. And I think this is what it would have led into with Black Bart. And I really like going into, one, the history of Mel Brooks, fascinating, talking about Blazing Saddles, always want to do. And this could even go into our spoofing series as well. So this sounds really interesting. He says, the pilot was on some editions of Blazing Saddles DVD as a bonus feature. Oh, I'll have to find that. But to my knowledge, none of the rest has ever been shown publicly. Wait, so does that mean they actually shot a bunch of episodes?
Well, or they could have just shot a pilot and then the pilot was never picked up.
We'll have to look into that. That sounds fascinating. I really like that.
Yeah, I never heard of this before. We went and saw a screening of Blazing Saddles in a theater once, and that was great. Watching comedies in theaters is always the right place to watch it, because
yeah, it is.
Everything is funnier when you've got an audience of people who are laughing, even if they're people who've heard the jokes before.
Comedies in theaters are great. Epic action films. So like... Mm-hmm. You're not going to get the experience of like Infinity War if you watch that at home.
Oh, no.
But when you're watching it in theaters and Captain America like is wielding Thor's hammer and says like,
being in midnight showing of Endgame at Disney's El Capitan Theater in Hollywood. Marvel Studios used that clip in one of their latest promo things of like audience reactions at that moment in a theater. I wonder if that was filmed in the El Capitan Theater, because if it was,
that means
my scream might be in that clip. I remember having no voice the next morning when I had to teach, and I really wanted to say, like, oh, I'm sorry I can't talk today because Captain America lifted Thor's hammer!
Yeah.
You know what? Watch every movie in a movie theater.
Every movie in a theater. We have a email from Colin Tripp. He says, hello, Daniel and David. Is everyone calling us by our first names now?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah. I don't usually write to any podcasts, but when Justice League Detroit was mentioned, I thought this would be a good opportunity. Yes. Always bring the corrections. I love this. As you mentioned, you didn't look much into JLD. That's true, which is understandable. The information y'all had on this podcast was extremely in-depth. Yeah, it was quite a lot that I did have to go through. And Justice League Detroit was just like, I had to decide whether or not I needed to go into it or just be like, that's just a thing that happened. And maybe Michael Spellisy has something on it, which unfortunately he didn't. But he goes on saying, but I would like to point out the importance of Justice League Detroit. While it will probably never be anyone's favorite DC book, it is notable for introducing us to not only Vi, but Gypsy in the second Steel, aka Commander Steel. Ooh. It was also the first time we saw Vixen as the full-time Justice League member. So yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, like those are huge characters, especially Commander Steel. He also has one more correction. It says, P.S. Jesse Eisenberg is Lex Luthor Jr.
Oh, what?
I was right. I mean, given I'm not seeking out and watching Batman versus Superman constantly and didn't really feel the need to dissect that movie as much as I should have. But I had my suspicions, which I'm still an advocate for. Like, I love Jesse Eisenberg's character and how he approached it. Still not a fan of like him being presented as Lex Luthor, but had everyone just said like, oh, that's Junior, or like that's Luthor's like bratty young kid or whatever, like it all makes sense. And I like how he approached it in that sense. But yeah, thank you for that. We have another email from Jonathan Liebrach. Dear, how did this not get made? I've been listening to your podcast recently thanks to Tony Goldmark and absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
Again, thank you for Tony for coming on and bringing us thousands of listeners. Anyway, I also wanted to make a few suggestions as well. So he put in George A. Romero's Resident Evil movie. I was unaware of him doing Resident Evil, although it does make sense that Resident Evil in pre-production, they'd be like, you know who should we get to direct the zombie movie? George A. Romero.
We should get Mr. Rogers' best friend. Have you heard that story?
No.
Mr. Rogers and George Romero were like really good friends because they grew up in the same town. And when Fred Rogers was a chaplain, he hired young and experienced George Romero to film some commercials for him.
Oh, that's really cool.
So like the two of them were just like lifelong friends and stuff. And it's really funny that Mr. Rogers is good friends with horror director George Romero.
That's amazing. It's like whenever you hear the history of like Snoop Dogg and just like the weird random connections he has.
Oh man, what's her name?
Martha Stewart.
Martha Stewart, yeah.
He's friends with Martha Stewart. Like he sold weed to Cameron Diaz in high school. Like
my other favorite thing like that is that Tommy Lee Jones and Al Gore were roommates in college.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What was it? I believe John August. He's a writer and he's one of the hosts of Script Notes. He has talked a lot about how he was roommates with Ted Cruz in college and how he was the worst roommate he's ever had.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, my word. Oh, I gotta hear about. That's amazing.
Yeah.
John August was roommates with Ted Cruz?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good.
We also have a few other suggestions as well, some of which I think I'm actually going to do. Joss Whedon's Wonder Woman which I'm actually all for, because I had thought about doing this even back in season 1. And my only thing was like, I kept doing more DC. There's so many DC movies that just have not been made. And I can't just have a whole season to it. So I'm like, I'm just limiting myself to maybe 2 or 3, like even superhero movies at that point. So season 3, I think, definitely will include the Joss Whedon Wonder Woman. I know that there's been a lot of stuff that's been coming up lately, especially with Zack Snyder coming out with his version of the Justice League, and everyone's kind of looking at Joss Whedon now and kind of evaluating the stuff that he's done. While working at Warner Brothers, like that was always rumored while I was there directing the Justice League, at least his version of the Justice League. And everyone's like, well, did you know that he wrote a Wonder Woman movie and it's not that great? Well, this seems interesting. So I think this will finally be the season where we cover Joss Whedon's Wonder Woman.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, that's different than a pilot that didn't get to air or something that featured Pedro Pascal in it. And apparently he forgot that he was in that when people brought it up when he was on the press tour for Wonder Woman 84. Is that different than the Joss Whedon Wonder Woman? I think those are two separate things.
I am unaware of it. When we do cover it, I will look into it, because I'm sure that's going to be part of the history. Because part of it is that I want to go over the history of Wonder Woman and how that got created, because how she was created was fairly interesting, because the guy who created it, he was part of it was like this unofficial throuple.
Yeah.
He was married to this one woman, and then they brought in another woman to be like part of it, but they just never, I mean, there was no way to really make it official legally, but they were like, she's part of us too. But that woman, she founded Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting to see like where he was at as far as like feminism goes. And then for her to go off and found Planned Parenthood, I think is very interesting. So I definitely want to dive into the history of Wonder Woman, partly for that reason alone, and to go into the more detailed history of that character.
There's a biopic about them, and I need to watch it. It's called The Wondrous Women of whoever the guy's name is.
Exactly. This is why we need to do our research, because we're just kind of generalizing everything. We want you to know the facts. Yeah. Next, we have Tim Burton's Catwoman. Not aware of that. Another DC movie. Probably won't make it into season 3, but it's definitely on the top of the list of like, I need to do this movie. The script for the 90s Iron Man movie. Ooh. I forgot who wrote it. We actually did mention this before, because when we were talking about Superman and Nick Cage being cast as Superman, I did mention that he was cast as Tony Stark also in the mid-90s as well, which I thought also would be fascinating to do. So I think that's another one to go into. And since it's not a DC movie, we may be able to slip that in as well. What's the other suggestion here? He says, the original script for Batman 2 before it became Batman Returns. This I wasn't fully aware of. I think I mentioned this in our Batman episode. I know that they were trying to introduce Robin. Like they tried to introduce him in the first film and just couldn't make him fit. They also tried to introduce him in the second film. Again, couldn't make it fit. So I imagine that there were definitely some rewrites to it. Although I'm not really seeing a full bigger story other than they wrote a Batman 2 film that turned into Batman Returns beyond that, but I'm going to definitely look into it. And if there is a bigger story, then that's something I will look into. This is from Don, or Caricatures by Don. Hey guys, enjoying the podcast. I was wondering whether it's enough of a story to report on regarding the long talked about Gambit movie. Is it even still a thing? Maybe. I'm assuming it's been dropped since Disney bought up Fox. I don't think so. I think everything's on the table now. Do you know any more about it? Might make for an interesting episode. Sincerely, Don Pinsett. Wait, Don Pinsett.
Don Pinsett. Yeah. He's a long-term listener of Weird Alphabet and all of our stuff.
Yeah, I'll look into that. I don't think they would drop it. Disney, the reason for buying up Fox is so that they could like reclaim a lot of those characters.
I think this is something that was like at the time of X2 and X3. If I'm remembering this correctly, because I feel like I remember hearing talk about a Gambit movie from a while ago that just never got off the ground. I don't know if how much more there is to it, but I do feel like I remember like when I was in high school hearing people talk about a Gambit movie.
Okay. I'll have to look into it. I think there might be something there. More so, my guess is that they might be recycling that idea, because I know when Disney bought Star Wars, a lot of the scripts, movie ideas, things that were made for like the TV show for Underworld, a lot of it wasn't really taken off the table, but kind of recycled in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking this up now. So it was supposed to be after X-Men Origins Wolverine. This was supposed to be like another X-Men Origins film.
Oh.
They cast Channing Tatum to star.
Interesting.
And then it was officially canceled by Disney in May 2019. So I don't know. It seems like there could be some story behind that one.
Okay. I'll look into that. Here's another one. This is from Gloria Bright. It says, "Hi, fan of the show, and I remembered a bit of media that's interesting. This is a part of Lost Media that I was part of the search for a few years back, where we found out it didn't get made. A Day with SpongeBob SquarePants the movie." Okay. A parody mockumentary about SpongeBob being a washed-up actor using a contest where a kid gets to spend a day with him. It was supposed to be made by this low-budget studio that makes cheap documentaries. I don't know if it's the best episode because the search for it was almost more interesting than the film itself. I mean, that's kind of what we find as well, but there's a Lost Media Wiki article if you dive down this rabbit hole, and there is the link for it.
Okay.
My guess is that because Viacom, Nickelodeon own the rights to the SpongeBob SquarePants image, my guess is that because of that, and kind of taking out the reality of like SpongeBob being an actor, I feel like may have looked negatively upon the character. And that's the reason why it may have been shut down. But that is definitely something that we can look into and see.
I can't tell based off of the description. It sounds like it might have been an unofficial thing, like almost in the same way like Escape from Tomorrow was this underground, unofficial parody of this massive media conglomeration.
Or, Jaws 3, People Zero was definitely not a Universal production. So I think because it was an outside production. But then again, we are speculating, which is why we do the show, to actually find out what the truth is. I will look into that because that does actually sound interesting. And diving into the history of SpongeBob, one of the 90s kids television animated shows is still around, would be something to look into.
Yeah.
Oh boy. This one I was not looking forward to. Okay. So this is actually from one of my friends. His name is Johnny Wixon. He says, "Hi, I've really enjoyed season 2. Thanks for your hard work putting it together. I also wanted to say thanks to Dan for taking my advice for my last letter. He sounds way sexier. David, the ball's in your court now." One issue I had back in the Jurassic Park episode, Dan had trouble pronouncing dinosaur names. Since you seem to read these emails in their entirety, no matter what, I thought I'd list some dinosaurs, starting with D, for both of you to work on. For the listeners at home, I included pictures in which should help in no way to pronounce them, but they look cool. All right. We have the Decantrosaurus, the Daspletosaurus, fun, Datasaurus, okay, Deinonychus, not even close. The Deinonychus, the Deltadromeus, the Dicrasius, Dilophosaurus, I know one of them, Diplodocus, no idea. Who is making these up?
Wait, Diplodocus? Is that what you were going for? Diplodocus?
No, it's an O, not an I. I don't know. Dreomysaurimus, leaving that in there. Dryosaurus, Dritosaurus, and the Dubriosaurus. I'm sorry for any paleontologists that listen to the show, because I have butchered, I think, all but one, and the one that I was probably most confident in, I probably most likely got that wrong too. Oh, man. He continues saying, "Congrats, you made it through. Here's your reward. What do you call a dinosaur with one eye? Do you think he saw a saurus?
Oh.
What do you call a dinosaur with an extensive vocabulary?
Thesaurus.
A thesaurus. Why can't you hear a pterodactyl go to the bathroom? Because the P is silent. I would like to include a drinking game based on your podcast. So, drink when it cuts to an audio clip. There's a special guest. Every time someone mentions they love Star Wars, they say the word trope. They talk about the U.S. trying to bring a British show or movie.
Now, for that one, do you have to just be like steadily drinking during an entire episode of British show in America?
I think once we just bring it up the one time, you just take a drink and you're good to go for the rest of the episode. They reference an earlier episode. That is every time. They reference doing another podcast or say fahuquapods, which you spelled that one wrong. It's spelled just like it's pronounced.
Fahuquapods.
How do you spell that?
FHQHWP. No, wait. FHQWHPODS.
Yeah, exactly how it sounds. I don't know how that's so difficult. Dan says fascinating. Okay, that's the second person to call me out on this. But he called you out on something when David says absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Feel free to drink whenever Dan goes into an in-depth backstory. That seems to be a lot. And then 2 drinks if David gets to the contact us info correct. 1 if he messes up. Maybe not the best drinking game, considering that a lot of people that listen to us are driving at the moment. But I guess if you can, do it. Anyways, keep up the great work. Thanks for putting these together. Best, Johnny.
Thank you so much for the email.
And for this last email, this one actually comes from my dad. It says, I'm guessing you watched the Academy Awards last week and the story of Steven Yeun about his experience going to the movies when he was very young while living in Taylor, Michigan. You may have taken note of both the similarity and close proximity to your early extreme movie experience. You, me, and Mom went to see the movie Jurassic Park on Friday, June 18th, 1993, which seems like about a week after its release. The cost was $15.50 for the 3 of us. We got pop and popcorn for $4.75. We lived in Dearborn at the time. I'm not sure which movie theater we went to. There is a theater nearby in Taylor, but I can't rule out the theater at Fairlane Mall. Joey, who is my brother, he was just over 1 year old at the time. He did not get to go with us, so they had to get a babysitter. But looking at the dates, you may have realized that you weren't quite 4 years old at the time, but close. So this was June 18th. My birthday is July 24th. So yeah, it was pretty close to my birthday. I think the story we tell was when you were 4. Interestingly, the next day, Saturday, June 19th, we all went to the Detroit Zoo where they had a dinosaur exhibit, Dinosauria, which we went through and also bought a dinosaur toy. So attached to this email is a picture of the booklets we received for the self-guided tour. Oh, okay. And it says Passport to the Prehistoric, and then there's another one that says Once Upon a Dinosaur. The self-pedaled toy car in which you would use to reenact the flip-over Jeep scene from the movie, which purchased on your birthday a month later in July. We did take you and your brother to see much more milder movies about that time, and the re-release of Snow White was on July 19th, and that is from my dad. All right, so yeah, that helps clarify that story, because how would I remember how I was when I was 3 years old? Or I guess 4. When I started flipping cars over. Although I do remember flipping that car over many, many times. Now, emails aren't the only places that we usually get suggestions. We have, and this is kind of unofficial, we haven't really been promoting it as much, but on the other podcasts, Fahuquapods, they have their own Discord, and I guess on the Discord is a How Did This Not Get Made thread, which I'll look at every once in a while.
For anybody who isn't on Discord, we have a Discord server that's mostly for Pods, but we have other Pipe Dream stuff on there. We've got a channel set aside for discussion having to do with this podcast, which we've gotten a little bit of engagement on. A couple of cool things.
So what was the one suggestion? I don't know if you have it pulled up or not.
There was a couple of suggestions. So user Malkman is here suggested a couple of animation stuff. He was sharing, there's actually a Twitter channel called Art of Lost and Canceled Media, which is basically it's exactly what it sounds like. They tweet out demo test footage or stills and stuff from lost media or canceled media. And they were sharing some stuff from some DreamWorks animated projects by somebody named Alex Wanneroy, but 2 films called Larrikins and BOO, the Bureau of Otherworldly Operations. That movie Boo is definitely something interesting. It was an animated movie, and I believe I had heard that name before, but it's an animated movie that was supposed to star Bill Murray, which was going to be FBI for Ghosts. I don't know, that's what it is, the Bureau of Otherworldly Operations.
We've had a few other suggestions as well, but on Twitter. So we got a message from the Channel KRT podcast.
Yeah.
Channel KRT. If you listen to Tony Goldmark's podcast, they're a guest on there every once in a while. They do a podcast about kind of strange media in a way. If you ever think to yourself like, hey, what was that weird cartoon that I watched in the 90s? Most likely they have covered it. But they messaged us saying, hey, Tyler here. I don't know if you guys are looking for episode or guest suggestions, but I recently just found an early draft of the 1994's The Mask that is vastly different from the final movie. I believe this is from before they cast Jim Carrey and still wanted it to be in the vein of the comics. Oh, I didn't realize it was based on comics. And I wanted to see if you guys would be interested in discussing it in your show. I would love to be a guest on it. If possible, please let me know your thoughts. Thanks for the advice. Yeah.
I've actually never seen The Mask.
Ooh. So The Mask would be pretty interesting to go into the history of Jim Carrey's career, because that was the time that he exploded. Like, he was in 3 big movies at once. I believe it was like Ace Ventura, The Mask, and something else. And then that later went on into the animated series. Both Ace Ventura and The Mask got their own animated show because it was the 90s. And at that time, like, if a movie was successful, make it into a TV show. And there was a crossover episode between The Mask and Ace Ventura showing that both of those characters actually live in the same universe. Yeah, that would definitely be interesting to go into. And I mean, we are looking for guests for their season 3, and bringing on Channel KRT, I think, would be really interesting. Another suggestion we got, these are just smaller suggestions. On Twitter, we had from Wish He Was Traveling Salesman, said, sorry if anyone has asked before, but are you guys planning on doing the ill-fated 21 Jump Street / Men in Black crossover, Men in Black 23?
Have we mentioned that on here before?
I've never heard of this before.
Really? You haven't heard of this? Oh, man.
I've not.
Yeah, it was supposed to be 23 Jump Street was supposed to be a crossover with the Men in Black franchise. I remember hearing people talking about it on like film podcasts and stuff, being like, here's this thing that might happen that's super weird. It was also that time where Phil Lord and Chris Miller could do no wrong.
I guess they're still in that category right now.
I think people still really like Phil Lord and Chris Miller, but it was like right after 21 Jump Street and the Lego movie, and this was when they were still working on Solo before they got let go from that project. It was like, okay, these are the 2 guys who all of their movies sound terrible, but they end up being great. This sounds like a terrible idea, but it's Lord and Miller, so I guess it's going to be awesome. I don't know.
Huh. I actually like that idea. I think that's definitely a shoo-in for sure.
Yeah.
To wrap this up, we have from Ryan Downey on Twitter at DarthGeek1. He says, please, please, please do an episode about At the Mountains of Madness. So if you don't remember, I believe it was in our Halo episode, we talked about when they wanted to get Guillermo del Toro to do the Halo movie at first. He was busy doing an H.P. Lovecraft movie.
Right. Yes.
at the Mountain of Madness. So I think, again, that's really interesting.
Once again, Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah, I think we just need to dedicate a whole episode to like all the things not made by Guillermo del Toro. I think that might be the bigger picture there.
I feel like I'm going to become a bigger fan of Guillermo del Toro because of this podcast, just simply because of all of the movies he never made.
Either that or we have a lot more sympathy towards him for sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's it for the
All right.
suggestions.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for all your emails and your suggestions, for helping to find other interesting stories. If it's only me and Dan looking for movies, there's going to be so many blind spots because, again, it is very hard to find and know about these things. So I really, really appreciate getting all the suggestions, and there's lots of cool stories that I never would have learned about or heard about if it weren't for these. I definitely would have never heard about, things like Garfield Judgment Day if it weren't for getting email suggestions.
Yeah, that's true.
We will be going into our production of season 3 soon, and we'll let you know when you can start expecting those episodes. In the meantime, though, you can find other podcasts on the website, pipedreampodcast.com, which includes Come On Fahugwa Pods, Escape from Vault Disney. While you're at our website, you can also find a link to our Patreon page. We greatly appreciate all of our patrons there. That money helps pay for the feeds of our various shows, pay for website costs. You get access to special monthly bonus episodes, as well as all of our notes for the episodes we record for this show. Go check that out if you'd like to support this show. You can also find us on social media. We are on Twitter at HDTNGM and on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. You can also send us your emails for other suggestions. You can send all those suggestions or lists of dinosaur names to notgetmade@gmail.com.
I want to do 2 quick little plugs here. So, one, I'm going to be on another podcast, which is called If You Like Movies. It's basically just a movie review podcast. They bring people on, they talk about their favorite movies, but I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite movies for sure, Desperado, directed by Robert Rodriguez. Any chance to talk about him as a filmmaker, so you can go over and listen to that. Another one, I wasn't part of it, but the newest season of Canceled Movie Report just dropped. They just came out with their first episode as of now, and by the time this comes out, they'll have a few more episodes, but you'll be able to listen to their version of the Tim Burton Superman Lives, the one with Nicolas Cage. They do a whole production of it, and I've just been so giddy listening to it. Like, it's one of my favorite podcasts of all times. If you're needing more material of like movies that didn't get made, like that's the place to go to.
Absolutely. Thank you everybody so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.
All right, thank you.